Hi, my Trinity friends, this is Ms.Jo. Today I am going to be reading Mr. Bump, who is another one of our Mr. Men, and it's by Roger Hargreaves. This is the sad story of Mr. Bump. The trouble was that Mr. Bump just could not help having accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, he would bump right into it. He could be walking down the street, and you know what would happen next, don't you? He would bump into a lamppost. Mr. Bump was just the same at home. He lived in an extremely nice house, but even there, he couldn't help having little accidents. For instance, one morning when Mr. Bump went outside his house, he noticed that his chimney had come loose in a storm the night before. "I must fix that before it falls off," thought Mr. Bump to himself, and he hurried to his garden shed to fetch a ladder. It was a very long ladder. Mr. Bump walked up the garden path with the ladder on his shoulder. He turned the corner of his path and crash went the living room window. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump, and he turned to see what had happened. Crash went the kitchen window behind him. "Oh dear," thought Mr. Bump again, and he rested the ladder against the wall of the house so that he could climb up to the roof to mend the chimney pot. Crash went the bedroom window. So you can see how Mr. Bump has lots of little accidents. Mr. Bump has had many jobs, but somehow they never seem to last very long. As soon as anything gets lost or broken or splintered or chipped or snapped or cracked or torn or crunched or split, Mr. Bump gets the blame. For instance, when Mr. Bump worked on a farm, he tripped over the farm dog, spilt the milk which he was carrying, and the farm cat lapped up all the milk. For instance, when Mr. Bump was a mailman, he got his hand stuck in a pillar box and they had to fetch the fire brigade to come and set him free. When Mr. Bump was a bus conductor, he fell off the bus and couldn't catch it up again, and all the passengers travelled without having to pay. When Mr. Bump was a carpenter, he found that when he was hammering nails and he hammered his thumb more times than he hammered the nails. In order to recover from all these rather unfortunate accidents, Mr. Bump decided to take a holiday. There he could think about what sort of job he could do without being such a nuisance to everyone. So he set off to the station to catch a train to the seaside. While Mr. Bump was on holiday, several things happened. He fell off a boat into the sea and the lifeboat had to come and rescue him. One day, when he was quietly walking along the beach, he got his foot stuck in a bucket and he couldn't get it off. He had to walk around with it on his foot for hours. Another time he was walking on the beach, he walked straight into a large hole that someone had dug, and he had to stay there all night because he couldn't climb out on his own. However, despite all these little accidents, Mr. Bump enjoyed his holiday. And while he was there, he had a splendid idea about what sort of job he could do. It was quite the best idea that Mr. Bump had ever had. And now Mr. Bump works happily for Mr. Barley the farmer. Mr. Barley has a rather large apple orchard on his farm, and that is where Mr. Bump works. Mr. Bump's job is picking apples, but he doesn't use a ladder to climb up a tree to pick the apples like the other apple pickers do. Oh no, Mr. Bump has a much better way of picking the apples. He just walks about. And before long, Mr. Bump, being Mr. Bump, walks into a tree. Bump. And down falls an apple, and Mr. Bump catches it. This makes the job of apple picking much easier, and Mr. Bump is very pleased with his new job, and Mr. Barley, the farmer, is very pleased with his new apple picker. So you see, the story of Mr. Bump isn't such a sad story after all. And if you ever bump yourself, you know what to do, don't you? You go and eat an apple picked by Mr. Bump, and then you won't feel your bump anymore. You'll have to remember that the next time you have a bump, won't you? Good.